Thanks, Chuck. And let me just remind everybody that on your badge you have the thumb drive that has all of the papers from the academic sessions. Really marvelous work. And my only regret on those kinds of events is that they are breakouts and we don't get the interaction. So part of what we wanted to do today is bring the four moderators together and have a bit of a synthesis and talk a little bit about what happened and what maybe that means going forward for the conference. So before I turn it over to my colleagues who were moderators who did a lot of hard work, I'd like to just make a couple of parenthetical comments. It seems to me that this conference series is circling around a very important idea, which is that cities, when they function well and when they maintain equity, as people earlier today were discussing, have an astonishing inherent capacity, a structural dynamic, as the previous speaker was describing a little bit, that can promote the capacity and the capability of their residents, all of their residents, to secure and to enrich their quality of life, both individually and in common. But there are very specific structural requirements for that process, requirements that exist at the level of streets and sidewalks and lowly little places that are places for human beings. That's the notion of places and placemaking, I think. And I think that was, by the way, the real point of Jane Jacobs' marvelous work to go back to what was talked about a little bit earlier. I suspect she would have considered the topic of racism, for example, a very large issue that was beyond her concern about this dynamic of cities, any more than issues of ageism or sexism or anti-Semitism or many, many other issues we could be talking about and should be at some point. But this core focus, I think, for her and for us is this notion of the inherent dynamic of an open and equitable city, and how we can put that dynamic to work for us. And yes, power is part of that issue, power in a democracy, how it's distributed, how it occurs spatially, how it's democratic and equitable, how it occurs and is created in specific places, and how those are adjacent to one another. And we can see, and I think a lot of the evidence is showing, those dynamics produce astonishing benefits, economic benefits, health benefits, well-being, creativity, and so on. I think this is the core idea behind this broad concept of placemaking that we've been discussing, creating networks of places. Thank you. Thank you, Fred. And creating networks of places, or more accurately, empowering the capacity of citizens to create for themselves and modify and evolve their own spaces. I think that's a very important point that we maybe haven't talked about enough. I suspect this is, in fact, a new agenda in many ways, in practice, in education, and in policy. But if that term placemaking is not to be dangerously vague, all things to all people, I think we have to define in concrete terms the actual structural characteristics of these capacity-building places, the different groups and their dynamics of power and control and interaction, how they operate spatially and as adjacencies to one another, what we need to do to tap this remarkable power of urban place networks. And a special burden is on us, I think, as professionals and as academics and as reformers, to provide agenda-driving evidence that these urban places will, in fact, be more productive, equitable, diverse, and sustainable. But luckily for us, there is a rich body of research emerging in many fields today that can help us to do precisely that, including sociology, public health, economics, environmental psychology, network science, mathematics, and really a number of other fields, in addition, of course, to the design professions and the work research going on there. And this body of research is just what yesterday's academic sessions were really designed to explore and to begin to gather together and to report back to you. So let's remember, at a time when the globe is urbanizing at an unprecedented pace, when we're poised to create more urban fabric in the next 50 years than we have in all of human history. Think about that. And when we also face unprecedented threats from resource depletion and climate change and systems collapse, these issues take on really unprecedented urgency. cities can be enormous contributors to the problems that we face. We can, as Herbie Girardet says, the future of humanity may play out in cities. On the other hand, they can also be powerful contributors to the solutions if we will understand and harness this dynamic. However, if we're going to see this happen, I think we have to confront the disastrous professional mistakes we have collectively made, many of us in our professions, in recent decades, and mistakes that we're still making. The responsibility we have for the drastic changes in urban settlements around the world, in many ways driven by us in the privileged upper middle class, thanks to the models we and our leaders and our schools and our practitioners have created and continued. And this is still going on. Whatever our aspirations about political change, those are important, but I think we must have a pragmatic approach to taking structural steps to learn from these mistakes as a civilization and to adapt to the rapid changes that we're now confronted with. And it seems to me that this urgent agenda is very much at the core of this conference, what we're talking about. So in that light, I'm honored to introduce my hardworking colleagues who moderated the academic sessions yesterday. And they did cover a remarkable collection, 27 papers spanning a wide variety of topics of placemaking and with a focus on the role of streets as public places. Again, giving definition to that notion of placemaking. The session was divided into 4 complementary topics, each trying to give a little bit more definition to the notion of placemaking. Placemaking tools and teaching approaches, patterns and forms of placemaking, placemaking as a political and economic process, and new theoretical insights into placemaking. Each presenter was asked to express through its moderator the key conclusions and agenda issues that, as the attendees felt, should be agenda items for this wider conference. Issues urgently needing policy changes or educational changes or further research. So that's what we'll discuss, and we'll also cover some additional synthesis comments. And with that, I'll start by introducing my good colleague Joanna Alamanasianu, who moderated the session on new placemaking tools and teaching approaches.
Hello. I have the honor to, in a very short period of time, express what these 7 different people presented yesterday. Oh. How do I go back? Sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry. Obviously, I'm very nervous to be up here. I'm very sorry. What really came up was the fact that today, in teaching and in the tools that we have, we're not there yet. There's been a lot of criticism of architects and urban planners in these different sessions and even out there in the public, and rightfully so. So what we really need to do is to place what is the premise of our work. What are we trying to do? And our goal is the well-being of people. I think that we forget that, and that's the problem with most architects and urban designers, and that's the problem in most of the schools. We have to learn from the successes of what we've been able to do in the past, but all the past. We have to look at the failures of the existing environment. This has come up many, many times. We must learn how to borrow from places where it's been successful, not just come up with inventions. We must also turn to those theories that have helped us, and it's proven here during these 3 days how these theories of architecture and urban design and placemaking are so important, and how we can use those to move forward. We must also work with the people and in interdisciplinary teams. Claudia brought up a very, very important problem, and that has come up in many, many of the schools. As a matter of fact, in most, is how do we teach architecture and urban planning, placemaking in those first years. It's very important to show them, take them out there, explain to them what is going on, and again, bring back the idea that we're creating places for people, not just computerized designs or machines. Anna, she brought up the whole problem of the fact that we don't look at what we have. She brought up three different cases of studies to show where it works and where it doesn't work, and how we can learn from those. Anna, the second Anna, also showed us that we must not only teach the designers and the urban planners and the urban designers, but we also must raise the awareness of those out there in the streets, the society, people, the residents. And so she used the theories of Jane Jacobs to enlighten and to give people the sense of responsibility for their environment. Without this, the professionals will not be pushed to create better places for all of us. We often say that it's the fault of the architects. Well, it's the fault also of those who hire the architects, the urban designers and the placemakers. So we must raise their awareness about their own environment. Michael showed us that we have to have a hands-on approach to the problem. We have to look at the local and come and take the problems and the solutions from a local position. Here he was putting cones down in the streets. It was rather amusing to see how just by doing very small interventions, we can guide the public realm to become a better place. Stephanie was talking about our world of transportation in the sense that commuting, very often we think of where we're going to buy a place, where we're going to live, as where is it located and how long does it take me to get to this city or to that place? And we don't think about the quality of the transportation and the route that we must take, whether that's walking or on public transportation or even in the roads. What kind of experience do we have? Again, going back to the daily life of people and seeing how we can improve that daily life. Joël showed us that we really do need to look at the tools that we're using and the tools that are constraining us, the laws, the codes, and change them to reflect what we really want to create, and use them as guides to create better places. And our last presenter, Gabriela, showed us how even in a rather hostile environment of the schools of architecture, we can bring in subjects that are of real interest, that can change the way we're teaching architecture and urban planning. We all have to. We have to show the people in the street, but we also have to show the professionals that what have we created in the last decades, and what can we create in the future for the well-being of people. These must become obligatory courses, not just electives, as she has done in her school. So I can only encourage you to place, and I know that you all do, but encourage others too, out there, that the human being is the important person, the important goal, the well-being of people. Thank you.
We could have perhaps a Hippocratic oath, as Joanna and I were talking about. It might be a good thing for architects and urbanists to have. We have a couple more slides. There we go. My colleague, Elahe Karimnia.
I'm a bit short, better standing here. Hello, everybody. It's a privilege for me to stand here and present the result of the academic session I was moderating yesterday. My name is Elahe Karimnia. I am a PhD fellow at Royal Institute of Technology, Sweden. In our session, we had a dynamic discussion around different cases of street patterns around the world, and streets as network of connections and relations was addressed through the relation of spatial values and use values. And we addressed how a good grid and urban pattern can contribute to improving the life on the street and creating better places for future. We had a suggestion from one of our speakers that instead of we can also learn from the past, but we can go beyond and test our hypothesis in urban grid and see how our interventions in city can promote the better public life on the streets. I go quickly for the first presentation. Joasha in her research showed us the complexity of transformation of streets. She believes that vitality or identity of future places cannot be simply achieved by top-down intervention and requires city emerging systems. Itza discussed the spatial cognition and showed us how pedestrian network can adapt themselves with bad planning pathways. Bruna argued the modernist planning in Brazil and the possibilities for better practices for pedestrian and bicyclists. Hans and Grace brought up the available tools to design more complete and connected places. Andreas shared with us the great result of their measurements of street grids, which can affect the number of destination people can reach on the street. Juliana presented how old centers are affected by lack of some aspects in urban grids. And finally, Martin, by showing us some examples of streets in Buenos Aires, highlighted that how connectivity metrics can give us a better picture for improving life of the city streets. Thank you very much.
Now, our colleague Helen Letke, who has been also working very hard along with Elahe on producing the conference.
Thank you very much. So, hi everyone. I'm a colleague to Eli, and we're both PhD students at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. And I had the pleasure to moderate this session, the academic session, Understanding Placemaking as Political and Economical Process. And we had several really great presentations, and I first wanted to highlight some common points that I think brings all the diverse presentations together. So the first one was the understanding of the formal and informal processes as related to each other. What is informal can be formal by being really good in influencing how things are done, but also the formal guidelines will also affect what's going on in the spontaneous actions and tactical actions. Another issue that was brought up was safety. Because we heard about, for example, in the busking project, about buskers that were really popular, so they've been banned because they attracted too many people to the public realm, and that became a security issue. Also, we heard examples from the Olympic Games and mega events, how street festivities have been under pressure due to securitarization, and this is a major issue. Another point is that it's always needed to have sufficient data to understand both the context, the history, and the opportunities and benefit from any kind of project. So to say some words about the presentations, Cecilia and Mariano had an example or two examples from the city of Buenos Aires of the informal and formal processes. And one of their biggest conclusions that it's always important to respect diversity and consider inequalities, and there's always an interface between planned and spontaneous activities. The second presentation by Vivian and Nick was about the busker project, and they wanted to show all the opportunities and benefit from buskering all around the world, but also how these activities are being threatened by legislation, and they showed a very good overview on how this legislation works in different cities. The third presentation was Beatrice talking about mega events and street festivities. She has been investigating the Olympics since in Montreal, 78 or 76, and how the public space has been used during the events and also how it's been changing, especially since 9/11, when security has been a bigger issue. Nabil was unfortunately not there for presenting, but he has submitted a great paper about everyday tactics and the beneficial strategies of reclaiming streets. In the project Streetworks, presented by Laura and Malte, they showed us a study about two parallel streets in Berlin-Neukölln and how they've been able to map and understand the dynamics of these streets. This presentation by Catherine was about community building in the US and showed where professionals and local volunteers work together to improve the public spaces and create a stronger sense of community. And lastly, Michael presented his work with mapping and understanding everyday life and social networks in rural areas. In his example was from Kenya. For better understanding how the everyday life works in rural areas and in transforming areas, which will be future urban areas. So I'd like to thank all the presentators for really great work and excellent time management.
And one last session. This is the new theoretical insights into placemaking. And we had people from Africa, Asia, South America, Europe, a very broad cross-section of people from different circumstances, large cities, small towns, many different things. Many things are in fact different between different settlements, but some things are the same. And identifying how we can make shareable toolkits and maybe the tools that can be differentiated was an important theme. Placemaking is not a vague aspirational idea. It's something that we can quantify and measure and use analytical tools, not reductive tools. We don't want to think of it as purely a matter of numbers, but the numbers are good instruments to understand what's going on. It's about bringing people into proximity. That came up in several presentations. And the economics is a tool and an outcome of good placemaking if you understand how the dynamics work. Luana and Anna presented on small towns, made the point that small towns are not shrunk down big cities or even parts of big cities. They really have their own unique challenges and opportunities. Romulo talked about the social output of cities as a function of their morphology, drawing on the work of Luis Betancourt at Santa Fe Institute and his own work to talk about what is urbanity, what is placemaking, how can you measure it and be a little more precise in what we're describing and the dynamics of it. Matej described what has happened in his own home city in Slovenia, and the larger issue that sometimes economic challenges are opportunities for taking a break and understanding how to lay the foundation for good planning when you actually have growth, because we all know that rapid economic growth can be very bad for cities if we're not very careful about it. So times of downturn can actually be opportunities. Mohammed gave a fascinating case study of what's happening in Cairo and the deterioration and disappearance of many of the existing public spaces. It's not a question of the the neoliberal colonialization of these spaces. They don't exist for many people. There are a few that are unfortunately exclusive as well. So we need new design tools, new strategies, new ways of measuring performance. Esther gave a presentation, another fascinating case study in Hong Kong, where you have a very top-down, centralized government that is responsible for essentially master planning the city. And yet there were some inadvertent results of this process that suggest that we have an opportunity to recognize public learning and creativity, and yet we do need to fine-tune policies. It's not just that we need bottom-up instead of top-down. We need both, and we need an enlightened way to combine the two. So I think, as you can see, there were some great presentations and great discussions in all of the sessions, as my colleagues indicated. I think also we could see there's a growing movement and a growing body of evidence behind an agenda for professional and policy and educational reform, which is very badly needed, around streets as public spaces and around placemaking more generally. And so I hope this conference can play a useful role in pushing that urgent agenda forward, because if we're going to meet the challenges of the future, we have to employ, I think, a pragmatic, shareable, evidence-based approach to making successful public places for human beings. Thank you.